and then trying to stop it. And I'm afraid that this is the sort of idea that the word morality raises in a good many people's minds. Something that interferes, something that stops you having a good time. In reality, moral rules are directions for running the human machine. Every moral rule is there to prevent a breakdown or a strain or a friction in the running of that machine. That is why these rules at first seem to be constantly interfering with our natural inclinations. When you're being taught about how to use a machine, the instructor keeps on saying, no, don't do it like that, because of course there are all sorts of things that look all right and seem to you the natural way of treating a machine, but do not really work. Any thoughts on that, Professor?
That reminds me of when I was in the Navy Seabees, which was the first time I'd ever seen a radial arm saw. And the second class seaman who was instructing me about the use of that said, the first thing you need to know is that this will cut your arm off quicker than anything I know. And so I listened, and then the first time I put my hand on it, I moved my arm in such a way that had I pulled it, I'd have cut my hand off. And in very colorful language, he instructed me what did I tell you? Put your hand here, don't put your hand there. Right. Because our natural tendency is to do things in whatever way we think is easiest.
Right.
Which is I think, what C.S. Lewis is pointing to when we think that, well, God, why didn't God just let us do what's easiest or what seems best? He must be trying to be a spoil sport of some kind. Yeah. So there is a purpose to morality, is what this first chapter is saying, which is to prevent a breakdown in the running of the machine that God has created to run on him.
What y'all think? Anybody out there? Nope. All right, moving on. Some people prefer to talk about moral ideals rather than moral rules, and about moral idealism rather than moral obedience. Now, it is, of course, quite true that moral perfection is an ideal in the sense that we cannot achieve it. In that sense, every kind of perfection is for us humans an ideal. We cannot succeed in being perfect car drivers or perfect tennis players or in drawing perfectly straight lines. But there is another sense in which it is very misleading to call moral perfection an ideal. When a man says that a certain woman or house or ship or garden is his ideal, he does not mean, unless he's rather a fool, that everyone else ought to have the same ideal. In such matters, we are entitled to have different tastes and therefore different ideals. But it is dangerous to describe a man who tries very hard to keep the moral law as a man of high ideals, because this might lead you to think that moral perfection was a private taste of his own, and that the rest of us were not called to share it. All right, so what's he describing there?
Moral relativism, which simply stated is everyone having their own sense of what perfection looks like, and their own sense of how close to that is good enough.
So, okay, here's a question for all you out there in Zoom land. Are we as a church, as a religion, as theistic people, as believers, are we opposed to the world in that the world is morally relativistic and we are not? Is the world morally relativistic?
Yes, I think so.
What would be an example of that?
Oh, well, I didn't know you were going to quiz me.
Oh, maybe she dropped out.
No, I'm here, but I'm thinking.
Okay.
Feel free to move on.
Yeah, no, I guess I would push back a little bit, and I would say I think the 20th century saw a pretty big shift from relativism to absolutism. And I think they're both exist in our society. I think we tend to fight relativism when actually what we're up against is some absolutism.
Well, I don't know, Marcus. I think people are very hesitant to say that anything is absolute. There's no absolute truth, which is what leads to relativism. My truth about morality is just as good as your truth.
I don't think that's true. I think that's fighting yesterday's battle. I really do, because our view on marriage, for instance,
Right.
is absolutely morally wrong in an absolute sense to the world. That we are up against a moral absolutism that leaves no room for our view.
So what's their moral absolute? What is the world's moral absolute on marriage?
Well, it's a different definition of marriage, really.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, but we talk about this in the taboo class, that, you know, for instance, we have rules against people cohabitating. Mm-hmm. In our tradition, in our denomination. So if somebody comes to us and is cohabitating, we say, okay, well, you got to go through some hoops here that we don't believe that's right. But our statement of not right is an absolute wrong to many of the people we talk to.
Okay.
The problem is moral relativism implies that there is no right and wrong.
I think we're saying the same thing, but coming at it from two different directions. Everybody wants their view because of the freedom we think we've been given. If we're not free to choose whatever moral right seems good to us, it's like putting your hand in the wrong place. There is a right place to put your hand when you're using the radial arm saw, and there are because we're not created as our own landlords, as we'll see. There are things that we are subject to morally. He agrees.
So I don't know. I think Sully disagrees with you.
Okay, can I jump in?
Please.
I think even as Christians, we have morals relative to the era we live in. And, you know, we're not hard on gluttony, but we are hard on some other things. I mean, and I'm pointing at myself saying that, obviously, but our relative sins have changed through the millennia. And we regard some as much more wrong now that used to be tolerated, and vice versa.
Right.
I don't know if that adds anything or not.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. I mean, that's certainly true in the sense that we struggle, and I think this is true of all of us, and we're getting to where Lewis engages this. We struggle to be consistent in viewing things God's way. I think that's very true. Yeah, I want to caution, and I think we're running down a road where we're not engaging my teenagers in the world they live in if we're talking about moral relativism. They live in a world with some definite absolutes. Love is a definite absolute. It's a moral code of their generation that if for us to say that certain types of love are wrong is a morally absolutely wrong thing to say.
But that disregards the fact that there is a truth. There is an absolute
right. Well,
truth.
they're appealing to a different authority to find that truth.
Right.
No question.
Themselves.
Right. So all I'm saying is I want to caution us to go before we go down this road, because I think we're going down this road, and we talked about this in Taboo. If we get wrapped up in there is no truth in the culture, we might miss the fact that in the culture that my kids live in, or Melissa's kids, or Olivia's kids, the culture they live in has some absolutely definite moral absolutes that Christianity runs directly crosswise against. That's, moral therapeutic deism has some absolute truth claims that are contrary to Christianity. So in some sense, we're dealing with paganism more than we're dealing with relativism. So, all right, thank you for indulging me on that. All right, so he goes on to say this would be a disastrous mistake to talk about moral ideals rather than moral truth.
And why is that?
Well, I think we just talked about it. It would be a disastrous mistake to say that there is no truth, because that's what the notion of ideals goes to.
Yeah, he talks about then it would be okay if your ideal was, if you were seeking to reach an ideal, then you'd have, well, I don't commit adultery often,
Right.
but it allows for some commission of sin that is okay.
Yeah, I'm short of the ideal, but I'm getting there.
Yeah.
I'm a good guy compared to Hitler. Yeah. All right, let's move on. Perfect behavior may be as unattainable as perfect gear change when driving. That's back when we had gear changes when driving. But it is a necessary ideal prescribed for all men by the very nature of the human machine, just as a perfect gear change is an ideal prescribed for all drivers by the very nature of cars. And it would be even more dangerous to think of oneself as a person of high ideals, because one is trying to tell no lies at all instead of only a few lies, or never to commit adultery instead of committing only seldom, or not to be a bully instead of being only a moderate bully. It might lead you to become a prig and to think you were rather a special person who deserved to be congratulated on his idealism. In reality, you might just as well expect to be congratulated, because whenever you do a sum, you try to get it quite right. To be sure, perfect arithmetic is an ideal. You will certainly make some mistakes on calculations, but there is nothing very fine about trying to be quite accurate at each step in each sum. It would be idiotic not to try, for every mistake is going to cause you trouble later on. In the same way, every moral failure is going to cause trouble, probably to others and certainly to yourself. By talking about rules and obedience instead of ideals and idealism, we help to remind ourselves of these facts. So, is anybody uncomfortable with the word rules and obedience there? Nobody? Everybody's perfectly comfortable with it. I don't believe you.
We're not supposed to not be.
It depends on the obedience. I mean, it's like, I'm comfortable with obedience, but only to a point.
Prove the point.
Exactly.
You just proved the point.
Yeah, her husband is struggling to not say something about that. Yeah. Okay. Well, I think we should be uncomfortable with it, but it's okay to be uncomfortable with it, and that's what the point of what we're going into here talks about. Pull me a little closer here. Okay, now let us go a step further. There are two ways in which the human machine goes wrong. One is when human individuals drift apart from one another or else collide with one another and do one another damage by cheating or bullying. The other is when things go wrong inside the individual, when different parts of him, his different faculties and desires and so on, either drift apart or interfere with one another. So, okay, let's stop there and recap that. He's saying there are two ways that the human machine, that human beings go wrong. One is when we have conflict with another person, and another is when we have conflict internally. We all good there? Okay. You can get the idea plain if you think of us as a fleet of ships sailing in formation. The voyage will be a success only if, in the first place, if the ships do not collide and get in one another's way. And secondly, if each ship itself is seaworthy and has her engines in good order. As a matter of fact, you cannot have either of these two things without the other. If if ships keep on having collisions, they will not remain seaworthy very long. On the other hand, if their steering gears are out of order, they will not be able to avoid collision. Or if you like, think of humanity as a band playing a tune. To get a good result, you need two things. Each player's individual instrument must be in tune, and also each must come in at the right moment so as to combine with all the others. All right, let's stop there. You want to recap that for us, John?
Yeah, he's saying basically there's two ways that human beings go wrong. Either in their interactions with other people where they either become distanced from the other people or they collide with the other people in ways that are offensive. But he goes on to say, and that's sort of the corporate aspect of it, but there's an individual aspect there as well. And I sort of translated it to say that within the individual, you got mind, body, spirit, your psychological well-being. And if those things become non-coalesced or separated from one another, that's a problem. And if they collide with one another, that's a problem. So that's the two scenarios that he sort of draws in this paragraph. And that you have to have these things orchestrated in order for society to function and also in order for the individual to function.
So I wonder if anybody's ever known somebody whose rudder always keeps running them into the ships next to them.
Yes.
What's that, Doug?
I was talking to Lori, sorry.
Okay, no problem.
His rudder was a miss.
His rudder was, yeah. Do you know what I mean by that? You ever known somebody who just couldn't quit being in conflict with other people?
Think of people who irritate you.
Brother like that.
Oh, yeah.
I did.
My brother-in-law. Things like that.
Maybe in your families.
Yeah, that's right. So they're naming people over here. Yeah,
Oh, yes.
they're dumping them out. All right, let's move on before we all get ourselves in trouble. But there is one thing we have not yet taken into account. We have not asked where the fleet is trying to get to or what piece of music the band is trying to play. The instruments might be all in tune and might all come in at the right moment, but even so, the performance would not be a success if they had been engaged to provide dance music and actually played nothing but dead marches. And however well the fleet sailed, its voyage would be a failure if it were meant to reach New York and actually arrived in Calcutta. So then, morality then, it seems to be concerned with three things, and this is an important paragraph. If you got your pencils out, underline this one. Morality then seems to be concerned with three things. Firstly, with fair play and harmony between individuals. So the first point of morality, the first thing morality is concerned with is fair play and harmony between individuals. Secondly, with what might be called tidying up or harmonizing the things inside each individual. So here we've dealt with the outside and the conflict with others and conflict internally. So the second thing it's concerned with is tidying up and harmonizing inside. Thirdly, with the general purpose of human life as a whole, what man is made for, what course the whole fleet ought to be on, what tune the conductor of the band wants it to play. So first thing is how we deal with others. Second thing is how we deal internally. And the third thing is whether we're going in the right direction, whether we're sailing toward the right end.
Purpose.
So there's a question here. Lewis writes that morality is concerned with three things. So this sort of study guide summarizes it as fair play, character, and eternal accountability. Which of the three is the most pressing concern for you? Boy, that's a thick prompt. Anybody want to jump on it?
Fair play.
Fair play is the most, so how you deal with others is the most pressing concern for you.
And how others deal with you.
Yeah, yeah.
Both.
Anybody else?
Third.
The third one, yeah, where we're heading eternally.
Yep.
Yeah, I think, if you broaden this out a little bit, and Lewis is getting here is morality and religion are not synonymous, but they are overlapping concepts. And you could say that all three of these are purposes of religion, of faith. Is it helps us deal with others, it helps us deal internally, but it also helps us focus on where we're heading eternally. And maybe conflicts between churches, this just occurred to me when I was thinking about this the other day, conflicts between churches might be more a conflict between which of these three the church focuses on. I mean, there are those churches who focus on how we deal with others, fair play, how we deal with people around us. There's churches who focus on, and even whole faith systems that focus on our internal self-actualization, be your best self. And that's sort of the Oprah religion, right? Is self-improvement and self-actualization. And then there's ones that focus on eternal salvation. And ideally, we ought to be focused on all three, I would think. But for me, certainly the third, if you lose the third, the other two don't matter a fig.
Well, for me, I have met the enemy and he's in my heart.
Yeah.
I met the enemy and he is me. Lewis talks about the fact that people seem to be more concerned usually about the societal or the external fair play and harmony between individuals. And let me ask, if you look at the next paragraph, why does, not the next paragraph, but I think it's paragraph 6, why is it that the externals are what people worry about so much, their relationships with others?
Well, those are the things you can see.
Exactly. Yeah. Thank you. It shows. And so if you're a jackass, for lack of a better word, everybody sees it.
Yeah.
Although the jackasses seldom have looked inside themselves to make that diagnosis.
Right. That's true. Yeah.
Not that, I'm speaking as one who's been called that.
Well, I think too, that if you focus on the third one, that the other two fall into place.
They should, but my gosh, that's a hard row to hoe.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's the weed that's the row I look at that's full of weeds, and I just got 1 4-inch hoe.
That's right. Well, and that's the problem with the me and Jesus is if you only focus on the third one and you forget how you interact with the church or how your own spiritual life is doing. Yeah. A lot of implications here. All right, let's move on. You may have noticed that modern people are nearly always thinking about the first thing and forgetting the other two. People are nearly always thinking about how they interact with other people and forgetting about the other two. When people say in the newspapers that we are striving for Christian moral standards, they usually mean that we are striving for kindness and fair play between nations and classes and individuals. That is, they are thinking only of the first thing. When a man says something about something he wants to do, it can't be wrong because it doesn't do anyone else any harm. Boy, that's important. He is thinking only the first thing. He's thinking it does not matter what his ship is like inside, provided that he does not run into the next ship. And it is quite natural when we start thinking about morality to begin with the first one, with social relations. For one thing, the results of bad morality in that sphere are so obvious. This is just what Olivia just said. So obvious, impress on us every day. War and poverty and graft and lies and shoddy work. And also, as long as you stick to the first thing, there's very little disagreement about morality. Almost all people at all times have agreed, in theory, that human beings ought to be honest and kind and helpful to one another. But though it is natural to begin with all that, if our thinking about morality stops there, we might just as well not have thought of it at all. Unless we go on to the second thing, the tidying up inside each human being, we are only deceiving ourselves. So what is that called? The type of moral system that focuses only on what is the best result for the most people.
Utilitarianism?
Yep.
Yep.
Trevor, for the win.
He read the chapter.
He read the chapter. That's right. Utilitarianism. Yeah, is what we're talking about there. Utilitarianism is the system that says as long as nobody gets hurt, as long as whatever, it's the Mr. Spock from Star Trek. It's the most good for the most people, and it's okay to do bad as long as it results in the most good for the most people. Yeah, John Stuart Mill and all that stuff. All right. Okay. Anything else you want to add?
No, short paragraph, relatively speaking.
Let's move on. What is the good of telling the ships how to steer so as to avoid collisions if, in fact, they are such crazy old tubs that they cannot be steered at all? What is the good of drawing up on paper rules for social behavior if we know that, in fact, our greed, cowardice, ill temper, and self-conceit are going to prevent us from keeping them? I do not mean for a moment that we ought not to think hard about improvements in our social and economic system. What I do mean is that all thinking will be mere moonshine unless we realize that nothing but the courage and unselfishness of individuals is ever going to make any system work properly. It is easy enough to remove the particular kinds of graft or bullying that go on under the present system. But as long as men are twisters or bullies, they will find some new way of carrying the old game under the new system. You cannot make men good by law. You cannot make men good by law. And without good men, you cannot have a good society. That is why we must go on to think of the second thing, the morality inside of the individual. How do y'all feel about that statement? You cannot make men good by law.
I think it fights against almost every system of government that we've tried.
Yeah. Yeah. What's the point in having a law against recreational drug use? It doesn't hurt me if somebody else is strung out on the street, right?
Right.
Not directly.
Right. Well, that's how we end up getting to the law is,
Yeah.
well, it actually does affect me.
It does.
What is this chapter, this paragraph reminds me of something we've already learned in this book. Can y'all think of, what does it remind you of? Or if it does at all? It just reminds me of the first chapters where it talked about the reason why people argue.
Yeah.
Is because we have a different view of right and wrong.
Right.
And we recognize by that, hopefully, that there is something above and beyond. There is a true,
Right.
absolute right and wrong.
Yeah. There is
It
right and
does
wrong.
exist.
Yeah. But do you believe we can legislate morality?
No.
It doesn't make a man good. You can legislate it.
Right.
You can't make someone adhere to it because you dictate it.
Go ahead, Trevor. What were you saying?
No, I was saying that we already legislate all kinds of things. Why stop with morality? All that good stuff.
Yeah.
Well, it won't work unless character is in place.
Right. And that is why he says we must go on to think of the second thing. Okay. He says, he continues, I do not think we can stop there either. We are now getting to the point at which different beliefs about the universe lead to different behavior. And it would seem at first sight very sensible to stop before we got there and just carry on with those parts of morality that all sensible people agree about. But can we? Remember that religion involves a series of statements about facts, which must either be true or false. If they are true, one set of conclusions would follow about the right sailing of the human fleet. If they are false, quite a different set. For example, let us go back to the man who says that a thing cannot be wrong unless it hurts some other human being. He quite understands that he must not damage the other ships in the convoy, but he honestly thinks that what he does to his own ship is simply his own business. So in other words, this is the person who says, it doesn't matter why do you care what I do? It doesn't hurt you. And I think we've probably all said that at some point, right?
Yeah.
But does it not make a great difference whether his ship is his own property or not? Is his own ship his own property or not? Does it not make a great difference whether I am, so to speak, the landlord of my own body, my own mind and body, or only a tenant responsible to the real landlord? If somebody else made me for his own purposes, then I shall have a lot of duties which I should not have if I simply belonged to myself.
He said duty.
Yes, Doug, thank you. But this goes to what Jenny was saying earlier is we tend to justify our own sins based upon whether they hurt another person, don't we? Yeah. Gluttony we don't talk about. In fact, in our tradition, it's we have at times taken pride in wanting to be quiet about drunkenness. We don't want
Judge not,
Right. Yeah. Well, let the Baptists be moderate. We're allowed to drink. And that attitude itself forgets that the body that we are making tipsy, the body that we are doing things with, doesn't belong to us.
I think his perspective that he begins with, different varying beliefs about the universe affect behavior.
Right.
And I think what he's saying is there a prime mover? Is there a creator whose overall things are not?
Right. And this goes back to, and we talked about this last week, or 2 weeks ago when we last met, but it was probably, we think it was a year ago, 2 years ago, we sort of preached a series on the fact that behavior follows relationship, not the other way around. We can't behave ourselves into a relationship with God. Our relationship with God shapes our behavior.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And if we are in right relationship with God, we don't do the right thing so that God will love us. God loves us. And because he loves us and we love him, we therefore do the right thing. We try to, and we all fall short.
That's flawed. I mean, it's the same thing as the third thing he talked about, which was purpose. I want purpose to be about me.
Right.
I don't want purpose to be about, in my fallen nature. That's what I want.
Well, that's what we're told, right? Fulfill your purpose. That's your job, is to find what you're passionate about, fulfill your purpose. And that isn't the same thing as finding God's purpose for your life, as finding what God is passionate about you doing. So, yeah. Okay. Again, Christianity asserts that every individual human being is going to live forever. And this must either be true or false. Let me read that again. Christianity asserts that every individual human being is going to live forever. And this must be either true or false. Now, there are a good many things which would not be worth bothering about if I were going to live only 70 years, but which I had better bother about very seriously if I'm going to live forever. Perhaps my bad temper or my jealousy are gradually getting worse, so gradually that the increase in 70 years will not be very noticeable. But it might be absolute hell in 1,000,000 years. In fact, if Christianity is true, hell is the precisely correct technical term for what that would be. And immortality makes this other difference, which by and by has a connection with the difference between totalitarianism and democracy. If individuals live only 70 years, then a state or a nation or a civilization which may last for 1,000 years is more important than an individual. But if Christianity is true, then the individual is not only more important, but incomparably more important For he is everlasting, and the life of a state or a civilization compared with this is only a moment. That is something I think Americans have a hard time with. American evangelicals have a hard time with.
I appreciate Lewis's thoughts on this, but at the same time, if somebody's ill temper or jealousy got incrementally worse, we see it over a course of 40 years. Somebody's jealousy or ill temper can make them, you can't live with them.
Right.
So
Yeah.
it can be hell on earth within 40 or 50 years.
Yeah, I don't think he's saying it's not. I think what he's saying is if you compare that to eternity.
Right. I get his point.
Yeah.
Right.
What do y'all think?
I'm thinking what kind of nasty creature somebody would become given 1,000,000 years.
Well, you know what? In hell, there's no end to that. It just would, you would just, without Christ, what would stop you from just becoming your worst self?
Right. That's in Lewis's fictional book he wrote about this called The Great Divorce. There's this image of people just continually moving out further and further and further from the center, so that they can be more of themselves, and they just become more and more almost immaterial and less and less, more and more corrupt, less and less real in a sense. Whereas heaven is continually drawing in closer and closer and closer to what is more real. So yeah, if those things, jealousy is a corruption of the good, right? This going back to Lewis's point about evil doesn't exist on its own. So if jealousy is a corruption of the good, and it just becomes more and more corrupt over time because it gets further and further away from what's real. Yeah.
And it causes separate, which he said, the three things that are bad are to be separated wrongly,
right,
or to collide wrongly. And these sort of unhindered human tendencies cause separation, don't they?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Okay, so he concludes, it seems then that if we are to think about morality, we must think about all three departments: relations between man and man, things inside each man, and relations between man and the power that made him. We can all cooperate in the first one. Disagreements begin with the second and become serious with the third. It is in dealing with the third that the main differences between Christian and non-Christian morality come out. For the rest of this book, I'm going to assume the Christian point of view and look at the whole picture as it will be if Christianity is true. So how does the illustration of a naval fleet help explain how each aspect of morality is mutually independent? How does let me say that again. How does that image of the ships going alongside together help explain how the three aspects, person to person, internal, and in relation to the course that God sets, how does that help explain how the three are independent? If you go wrong on any one of the three, you've gone wrong entirely.
Well, I'm not familiar with the structure of the Navy, but you have, I think, sailor kind of at the bottom, then you have leadership at the top, and I think at the very top you have the admiral, and you want to make sure that the sailors are actually up to snuff. You don't have, I don't know, always drunken sailors all the time. You don't want them running the ship.
Right.
What if you just related it to 5 o'clock traffic in a very busy city? And, it's what you're trying to do is if things are in a formation with a particular purpose, what happens if the individuals in that formation, or if the formation itself disregards everybody else?
Right. Yeah, I think it's a helpful analogy, because if you're not dealing kindly with the people around you, then there's inter-car conflict. If your car breaks down, I think where that analogy breaks down a little bit is that everybody is trying to get to their own place in that analogy. And what he's saying is that in a naval flotilla, everybody's trying to get to the same place.
Yeah. Everybody's trying to get home safely.
Right. Well, that's true.
Yeah, that's the place.
Yeah. So there's not a whole lot of, it's a pretty straightforward chapter this week, because he's setting up sort of the scene for where we're going to be in the rest of this book. Any of y'all have any thoughts? Anything you want to share about it? How it strikes you? Yes, no, maybe.
Seems like Lewis is saying that there are moral absolutes, though.
Oh, I think he absolutely is. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Anything else for the good of the order? Well, thanks, folks. Hopefully this works out okay. And we'll be able to just do this. This simplifies our setup here quite a bit if we can make the Zoom thing happen over onto YouTube. So now that we have that worked out, we're getting a little bit better at this every week.
Yep.
And I kind of hate that, but it is what it is right now. So I miss y'all, and can't wait to give some of you, well, give all y'all hugs when Dr. Arscott tells me I can again.
Let me encourage you in your purpose. There are people in this church that you're friends with, and you probably are calling them to see how they're doing. But there are people who, they kind of keep to themselves. Mm. So please pray and think about not only the people that you're drawn to call to see how they're doing, but also the people that you might not by nature be drawn to call them, see how they're doing. It'll light them up.
Even if you think their ship's going to run into yours.
Yeah. Even if it hasn't.
Right. All right. Well, let me pray for us. God, thank you for this gathering. Thank you for, even though we got off to a little bit of a slow start, thank you for the technology that allows us to be together. Help us to get better at it. But Lord, we do pray that it's safe for us to gather together physically very, very soon. And Lord, in the meantime, may your Spirit unify and console us, and may your Spirit be the thing that keeps us connected amidst disconnection. And so we just give this time to you and ask you to bless it. And we pray it in Jesus' name.
Amen.
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 Love y'all.
All right, friends. Love you.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.
All right.
Bye.
Let's see if I know how to do this.